live. Hello, welcome to another Sunday with Josh and Calley. We're today kind of switching things up. We had a conversation in the week where we kind of went back and forth about what kinds of stuff we like to talk about in these live streams. And I think we were having a conversation actually about Calley was bringing up some stuff she knows about Aradia and Strega witchcraft, the Strega branch of kind of Wicca and whatnot. She knows more about than I do. And then how it's in Tuscany, and I know a lot about the Etruscans. We were thinking about talking maybe about the Etruscans or something. And we started to see some patterns. And I was like, you know what, why don't we just talk about this? Let's just have this conversation. And then today, we were talking through a little bit of research preparing for this conversation, and we discovered the connection of Lucifer to that in Strega tradition. And I already have all these kind of this backlog of ideas about the connection between the Etruscan chthonic sun god Suri, or Usil, and Lucifer, and kind of how a lot of the Renaissance Luciferian satanic occultic tradition was based in northern Italy around Tuscany. And I've been suspecting for a while that there might have been, of course there's Roman influence, but there might have actually been a fundamental Etruscan influence to some of those Renaissance thinkers. And Calley, I would consider you an expert on Renaissance occult. Honestly, I think you're pretty well read on that. Would you agree with me?
Oh, that's very kind of you. I don't know how well read I am exactly. I think it's been a bit more dabbly than other things, but we do have a wonderful book examples. We can't say we read this book. I don't know how much wider we went than that. It's not exactly the chunkiest either, compared to some of our other, when you look at something like In Search of the Indo-Europeans, which is a brick, it's a little lighter read. But we will be going through some excerpts from this today to provide some evidence about, that's one of the ones that was required reading back when I did the Druid Dedicant program with ADF.
This is
and
my
at the time,
this is where I read about the occult when I was a teenager. Manly people, that's a lot of people.
Most of the way through that one. So, you could say it's got some Renaissance stuff in it too. But a lot of my Renaissance influence comes more from interest in tarot and alchemy and things like that. But this is a very interesting crossroads of topics for us, I guess, because obviously Josh has a lot of interest and passion in the Etruscan pantheon in general, and this kind of stemmed from us looking at the question of what happened to the Etruscans, and that stemmed from an interesting conversation we had the other day, where Josh was asking about my experience in Latin class, because I took Latin for 4 years in high school, which is interesting for a number of reasons, but not the least of which, what was the motivation for that, or what was I hoping to get out of it, or why me, Latin, what's up with that? And so, like an edgelord, like you do in high school, I had this kind of know thy enemy, just go and learn as much about it as possible, because I was very rebellious, and Josh has talked a little about his teenage years, volatile, anger feels and stuff. So I had a similar thing going on, I guess you would say, but it manifested differently. And part of that was this intense study of Latin, which has turned out to be just so invaluable. It was great, because I could have gone any direction. Latin's really valuable, even if you are not super all about that Christian gospel life. It's a really handy life skill because it feeds into so many things. But I didn't really realize at the time, I guess, what kind of these different the chronology was really fuzzy, like as we were, because we studied like myths and history and poetry, and not just like the Latin language itself, but also the surrounding context, of course. But whenever like the Etruscans came up, or whenever the general like founding myth came up, or the chronology, it was like just a little fuzzy. And I guess I didn't really appreciate how fuzzy it was until we started talking recently. And it's like, well, how did my Latin teacher talk about the Etruscans? It's like, it's weird. It's a little bit like not separate, I guess is the thing I would say. It they were introduced as kind of like the precursors of the Romans, and the question of like, well, what happened to them then never had like a hard cutoff, or like it didn't have a hard answer. It just was kind of implied that they were assimilated somehow, but how exactly that happened, it's fuzzy. And we talked about like the Gaulish Wars, and we talked about obviously like some of the later time periods, but this whole like, and we talked about both the Romulus and Remus myth and the Aeneid and these things, but like never with any real rigor. And then Josh was like, "Whoa, okay, what's that all about?" So, how did it make you feel, Josh, when to hear like that whole bit?
I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I wouldn't imagine. I would imagine that your garden variety uh, professor is going to know very much about Etruscan, especially if they just focus on one particular language or not. Etruscan is forgotten by a lot of things, and I mean, I look at it as just like it's really so much of Roman is Etruscan, like just copy paste almost. And my hypothesis behind that, and it's not just me, it's a growing understanding that Rome or Ruma, um, Ruma being actually an Etruscan goddess of cattle, was an Etruscan city originally, or maybe pre-Etruscan Apennine, whatnot. Most people know about Tarquinius or Tarquinius, I mean, who is an Etruscan king. He became the king of Rome at some point, essentially instituting their kingship, right? So there's definitely deep roots between the two, but the general distinction usually, and this is in my Etruscan origins video, I talk ad nauseum there, so I don't need to talk ad nauseum here about the distinction between the Italic Indo-European languages and the Etruscan, possibly Pelasgian language, uh, um, pre-Indo-European language. And so the Romans would have been an example where it seems that the Italic Indo-European people who came in later usurped or took over leadership and such of Rome, and then the Roman Empire or the Republic built itself out of that, and so forth.
So I want to jump immediately to the hypothesis of yours, or your point about um, the Greek deities coming to Rome through this Etruscan lens. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, and before I do that, could anyone comment if they're in the chat if there's any kind of audio echoing and whatnot? I've actually had to manually mute myself when Calley's talking because I think my mic is so sensitive it's picking up her. If at the beginning of the video you hear that there is any kind of echo going on, please tell me so that we can maybe try to do a fundamental fix for that. Um, we'll just take a minute to like change things. But anyway, yeah, I can answer that real quick. So it's actually something I've been doing in my database casually lately. Um, I've been going into this category I have here under Etruscan on the left and Magna Graecian. And Magna Graecia or Magna Greece or Greater Greece is the name for southern Italy and Sicily. It's because it was colonized so heavily by the Greeks much later than even the Italic people got there. The Romans descended from, or the Latins, the Latin tribe descended from Italic tribes. They actually went all the way throughout Sicily and such, way before the Greeks even got there. But if any Greek deities got into Roman, it could have been also through the Samnites or another southern Italian tribe. Uh, that's possible because they were being actively colonized by the Greeks, right, to the south. But I suspect it's possible because Etruscan is such an older tradition, and the Latins and the Romans grew out of Etruscan, and Etruscan was definitely trading with the Greeks for a very long time, and possibly even, I mean, most likely even with the pre-Greeks, with their ancestors before the Bronze Age collapse, probably were trading with the Minoans and such. My running theory or hypothesis is that the Minoans and the Etruscans are directly related to the Pelasgians, and Etruscans were Neolithic people settling Italy. So there's a few deities that I have in like this list, for instance. I've been trying to go through the list because I made entries for them originally, and they're literally like Jason here. That's just the Etruscan name for Jason. So there's basically what I've found is that Hercules, there's all these deities that are literally just translations, like very as clear as you can possibly think, translations of Greek stories. And you see the same thing going on with Roman, with Greek stories. So like Hercules, which is the name that was picked up by Disney, is actually the Roman name for Heracles, because Heracles is the actual Greek name. Um, so, but like we don't distinguish between that because it's such a direct translation. Why would it be direct? Well, because the Etruscans lasted all the way up until the rise of the Roman Empire, which was somewhere around, I think it was 300 BC. It was around, like, basically the Romans picked up and started growing around the time that Alexander the Great had already conquered Persia, right? So it's actually very late in terms of um, classical Greek history. And so the Etruscans still existed while the Romans were growing. The Etruscans still existed, but Alexander the Great was conquering Persia, and they were still trading with the rest of the Mediterranean. So literally, they just had the written material, the stories, Homer and Hesiod, and all these Greek sources were just being literally transported and assimilated by the Etruscans. I want to look at a note here. Audio sounds good right now. Yeah, right now it might sound good. I'm going to give it a second to, if Calley says something, and see if there's a... Does that kind of answer the question? I know that's maybe not specific.
Yeah, could you be a little more optimistic? What if we actually fixed it this time? Come on. Yeah, I think that kind of answers it. Just like the overall, like the overlap, and I guess like this idea of translation, like how much direct contact did the Romans have with the Greeks compared to like how much Etruscan just like intermingled. Like when we start to looking at things like ancient hominids, we look at, did what happened to Neanderthals? Did they, there's part of the theory that they just like mixed in completely or like were phased out due to all these different factors. I think we've pretty well done away with the theory that they just got mauled and annihilated violently. But yeah, there's so many other intervals that are like that in, our ancient history. Like this one where it's like, it's not so much like maybe the Latin tribe went and demolished the Etruscans. It probably was more that they just completely assimilated. And like the way is kind of interesting looking at this like possibility that the Greek influence into Rome did not come directly perhaps from Greece as much as it came from the Etruscan translation of the Greek into the Italian sensibility. And we see that more in like Aplulu and a few of those other translations.
Yeah, Aplulu being Apollo. And that's a kind of a funny example because the Etruscans already had their own sun god that was actually kind of unique because he had very heavy chthonic elements. Apollo also has chthonic elements, But it's interesting that the Greeks came in here and then um, they just came in there and they said, oh, Apollo, and they adopted Apollo or a Plulu, even though they already had Suri, and so he was conflated with Suri in certain cases and then not. There's also stuff like in the chart I made for the Etruscans, I tried to separate and not bring in, I don't think, any of the Greek deities because their lineage would be the same as Greek, and that's basically a Greek pantheon. So like Aplulu and Artumi are the Etruscan names for Artemis and Apollo, and they have the same parentage, just with Etruscan names as in the Greek sources. But when you look at the lineage of Suri, it's a little more complicated. He's got a very interesting, unique lineage. Actually, I found it's a little more similar to Hittite, an Anatolian lineage of their sun god, who is, I'm forgetting right now. I think it's, I'll get to that at some point. But yeah, okay, so I'm reading here that you're a little, yeah, Calley's a little echoey. Definitely improved. Okay, it's listenable. Well, that's good. Yeah, the reason.
Within acceptable tolerances. That's what we're going for.
Perhaps. Is it acceptable tolerances? I hope so. I just have to maybe turn you down on my computer and try to listen very carefully. Otherwise, we can prevent it by putting on headphones. That would be the only other thing to do. Do you want to do that, Calley, or do you want to just go with it until it gets terrible, unless it's really bad?
I feel like it's fine. I don't know why you're...
Okay, I'm just checking. I'm always trying to improve the stream quality. So again, if anyone sees there's an issue, always comment. We're open to change and fixing everything. But yeah, we'll continue on. Let me find. Oh.
So with that premise in mind, I guess one thing we talked about that's kind of interesting that I want to touch on is the distinction between the Greek kind of sensibility of not worshiping ancestors or being kind of more hero-oriented and kind of not having the same concepts that you find in the Etruscan and then the Roman. The chief concept of that we kind of focused on was the Lares and Penates concept, which makes up kind of a lot of Roman embodiment practice, actually. And the best example I can give of this, like in culture context, would be like from Gladiator. There's a bit in Gladiator where when they're first picked up and the African guy has the wooden figures that he has of his family, and he's introducing them to Maximus. What that's representing, what that's actually supposed to be pointing to, and we talked about this in my Latin class all those years ago, those are actually figures that would be common for the Roman family to have in what's kind of like a puja, if you're familiar with that. It's similar in Hindu practice where you have like a personal shrine. You see this in like China and Japan. Sometimes they have an entire room. But in Rome, you would have kind of a little cabinet or like a alcove or a cubby. And usually it was like in the front of the house, depending on how rich you were or how much space you had. You would have like a little statuary zone that would be kind of like forward facing in public because you were kind of showing it off. It wasn't quite as private as something like a puja. And it would typically be focused on your alares, your regional deities, your tutelary gods, basically. You wouldn't necessarily have a statuette of, obviously not Jupiter or something, because those have big houses, right? They have the civil houses, which would be the temples where you go to see the big statues, but you would have mini versions in your home that would be like localized deities, like your city deity, and you would have your family ancestry deities, and perhaps even statues of the ancestors themselves, kind of like an ofrenda, basically, but it's up all the time and make offerings to it, right? So that's what that whole scene, and why, of course, Maximus is so familiar with this. He's like, yes, I have those too. But for your personal family, they would probably be more carved wood, because it's not like you can go down to the store and just pick up like your exact grandpa. You probably have to whittle it. And it was funny because Josh was doing some research earlier about carpentry and like the relationship between carpentry gods and like wooden carving versus like marble carving or versus like the forge god. So do you want to mention a bit about that?
Yeah, when you were talking about the Larrys, it brought me back to last week when we were talking about Baltic, and I was like the Laumes, and I was like, oh wow, so like, and these are like spirits of nature, but the Larrys are a little bit more, I guess, ancestral. But talking about, sorry, I all the different connections have got me going all over the place. What was the question you just asked again? It was
The significance of like whittling or wood carving.
yes,
As
okay. So there is. We were just looking into Daedalus, and I have a bunch of entries here because I kind of obsessed over it and wrote down a bunch of stuff. But Daedalus is the father of Icarus. He helped craft the wings that he flew up in the sun, and then they melted and he fell down. And Daedalus is said to have built the labyrinth for King Minos of the Minoans in Crete. And so he's like this great inventor. He invented many things. He's an architect. He's a demiurge of kinds, and he's a mortal man. But he's also credited to have like kind of invented the craft of carving wooden statues, sacred wooden statues of deities or of ancestral figurines and whatnot. And he's reported like the Greeks actually, whenever they dug up some of these or they used some of these, they were all credited as being made by Daedalus, as though he just like mass produced a bunch of these and put them everywhere. And that was interesting because I was like, okay, so this goes back to potentially a Minoan, Pelasgian, old Neolithic, potentially tradition. Otherwise, very much indicated. Ancestral worship is obviously universal, and that's why we were talking about the Greeks as an odd exception to that rule. Um, that's when we started to talk about kind of the idea of Achilles versus Hector. Hector is the defender of the city and the people, the city state, and the good king. And Achilles is this individualist, he just wants fame and glory. Agamemnon is an emperor who just wants to conquer everything, so he's the greatest, not necessarily in order to benefit anyone. Um, yeah, so, and it's all for like warfare, not necessarily for any other purpose. And so we were just talking about how it's like, why is it that the Greeks don't have or don't seem to have evidence of too much, at least very verbal ancestral worship, and we can see that when we look at Roman with how much of these different individual household um, ancestral totems and family lineage was very important too. The different, the patrician families in later Roman periods, right? Um, it's family is important. Obviously, the Greeks' family is important to every culture, but there's a different sort of reverence and deification almost that happens in Roman, and so we both kind of suspected this might come from a more chthonic, older tradition that's retained by the Etruscans, and again differentiating Roman from Greek quite substantially, because that's another thing that we kind of think about that isn't necessarily talked about very much. Um, People who just kind of glance at comparative mythology, they're just like, oh wow, the Romans, they had the same gods as the Greeks and they just adapted it, right? But really, no, a lot of them are somewhat different and some of the motifs are a bit different. And it has its own separate trajectory. Now, Greek and Roman, or Greek and Etruscan, both have sort of Pelasgian roots to some degree, and then Greek and Roman also have Indo-European influences that came in later. So that would explain why they might be similar, besides the influence that they did to one another. Of course, later when the Roman Empire, conquered Greece, that's when most of the syncretism actually happened. And you see kind of Roman and Greek syncretism everywhere that they went. They would just kind of, like how they went into Germania or Gaul, and they would look at Odin and they'd be like, that's Hermes, you know. Or I think we were looking into Gallic, and they had like spring deities everywhere. Everything was a spring deity because that's where they were worshipped. And they were all like conflated with weird stuff like Ares and whatnot, even though we didn't see it. It was kind of funny, but not to get too sidetracked. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so continuing on those Roman practices that are potentially very Etruscan, we'll kind of go through a couple of these as we're approaching the more modern Aradia a bit. We'll get into some excerpts from there. But the one word that stood out to you, Josh, and I heard it all the time in Latin, but sepulchres, which is sepulcher, and just the total like Roman funerary and burial practice being markedly pretty different from the Greek, and just the way that whole thing is handled, because the mausoleum is really treated um, as kind of like an external family shrine. It's like it's got all of the flavor of like the Lares and Penates, but also it's part of the civic, it's part of the public. And like the processions would be quite involved and quite grand, and like the offerings would be quite regular. And it was kind of, like the cemetery was just kind of a place to, you just run into people. It was just another place to be, like as part of the city. And like having these very elaborate um, being a patron of like your family's mausoleum, and like investing in a lot of like the statuary and the marble as kind of this permanent fixture to beautify the city, is evidenced by the word itself, sepulchres, which pulcher is beautiful in Latin. So like you were pointing out that that's kind of weird word. Actually, it kind of sounds a little more Etruscan.
Well, I was pointing out that it doesn't sound it's pulchery, right? I was just like, that doesn't sound Indo-European.
Well, we know it's not Greek. We know why we know that.
Mm-hmm.
What's the word for beautiful in Greek?
My brain's going to Galatea or something for some reason, but I know that's not.
You're fired.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm not good at remembering stuff very readily. What is it?
It's Calley.
Oh,
I'm
so stupid. Beautiful. Yes.
Yes, and that's what's
and that's
written
Greek.
on it.
That's I thought it might have been something other than Greek. I thought it might have been like Celtic or something. In your case, but okay.
No, yes. But with a K, and so like that's what's written on the golden apple of discord that was presented at the trial of Paris. Was Callisti? It's a dative form, which means to the most beautiful. So yeah, it's Kalli, and then if you go with a C, it actually means like Calle is like road in Latin. So you see that a lot in Italy.
Funny that you would mention
totally different. Like if you compare like Calley with pulcher, totally different. Like obviously,
yeah, something else is there. Now, which one is like older and pre-Indo-European or whatnot? I don't know. I would have to look deeper into the etymology of that. If anyone else finds out the etymology of pulchri and Calley in the name beauty, then they could post that in the comments. I'd be really happy to read that. Outside of this,
it's very marked and significant as like a word for practice, because so sepulchres, it's implying this beautification and this ceremonial quality surrounding death. So it's like very tied to the practice, and you see this word a lot in poetry, and it's just kind of a significant word. And you see that with the word sacrifice too, which is facere, which is to make sacred. So like that also comes with it, this sort of set of practices that is maybe a little bit different. And you see phrases like that in other cultures, like contemporary Muslim tradition. You have, to make wudu is a type of ablution. It's like to make clean, to cleanse, is this very active, thing to do. And so I think it's pointing to kind of a different mode of activity and worship than maybe some of the other Greek words, is kind of my vibe that I get from it.
In a sense, it's clearly very chthonic. Even just the idea of a cemetery is not particularly universal. The idea of burying the dead, I mean, at some point it's always been universal, of course, going further back. But cremation, for instance, and that's usually these days even the main distinction is like burial or cremation. There's other means, but cremation is something that was explicitly spread by the the Indo-Europeans. So like they spread it into Iran, and then they on the other half they spread it into the Balkans. And actually, some of that cremation practice, I think they tracked it, and it did influence Etruscan a little bit. Some Etruscan, I think more near the Po Valley, more like Ratians, they might have adopted that because they were heavily influenced by the incoming Italic and Celtic people. But the Etruscans themselves, with an older tradition, it was much more chthonic burial, and that kind of route of doing things.
Yeah, because burial taboos, that's a huge deal. And it's like a huge distinction in culture because there's a lot, like not employing cremation is, kind of makes you a barbarian in some of these taboos. It's like that was a huge distinction, like how you could tell, that they were non-believers or unworthy. So like there's a pretty big separation there. I think, and it's usually for very practical reasons, but it's interesting that you see like in Rome so much, real estate being dedicated. I mean, that's a huge part of it too. It's just like, well, if you have space being saved for the dead, there's less for the living. What's up with that? Is that a good trade? Do we want to do that? So you only see that to this extent in places with very extreme ancestor worship. And my kind of running theory, my hypothesis is that you mostly see those kind of chthonic burial practices and emphasis on ancestry in kind of matrilineal type of cultures. Although, of course, Rome itself, a little bit on the patriarchy side, but as far as like this lineage issue and this ancestor worship issue, I think you do kind of see that flavor and that gratitude practice and that appreciation a little bit more in that kind of feminine oriented tradition. And this we see like completely exemplified and in its strongest form through Strega. And if we do kind of take it at its premise and entertain the possibility that these are largely unbroken lines, at least as far as the practices, and perhaps, if you think of it in kind of a mitochondrial way, like maybe they are not unbroken in like a patriarchal sense or like a manly sense of like that it's got, my genes and my name and my this and, but if you're looking at it as, a line of witchcraft where like the master and apprentice relationship and like that whole thing and just like the sustaining of the myths and the practices is largely unbroken, I think there's pretty good evidence of that. We still talk about it. We're talking about it right now. And, for arguably, a religion that more effort has been put forth by certain other groups to exterminate than maybe others, I think they're doing pretty good. I think it's going pretty well, and reading through this book again, I was really touched by the foreword, which was acknowledging and like kind of participating in that ancestor worship to some extent, like the groundwork that's been laid by some of these contemporary Reconstruction thinkers, and like the people, in the case of this copy of the Aradia that we have, I was explaining to Josh that the compilation process, it wasn't, you might think of it kind of like a Brothers Grimm kind of thing where like they were actively going around to these kind of rustic villages and talking to people and trying to get these stories so that they could record them and write them down and like trying to kind of, and this was at the, turn of the century, 1899, I think it was. So like that type of curating and protection and preservation effort of something like witchcraft was kind of like wild at the time. There was a bit of it. You see this in like the Theosophists and the spiritualists were doing similar things just because they were kind of affluent and had a lot of time, and that was kind of the fun trendy thing to do. But in the case of like the Strega tradition where they're like going to all these little old Italian grandmas like, hey, so how do you think this went down? And some of the takes are pretty spicy. We'll get into those, but it's cool. The appreciation there is cool. I feel like it's very much like the process of getting this is embodying and participating in exactly what it's getting at. If that makes sense, it's very self-referential.
So before I I would like to make a note on Roman Catholicism and some of the stuff that's still preserved in that, and then talk. I think about this citation that Cora Persephone has brought in here about the meaning of beauty here. But before that, very quickly, could you just um, quickly give a little bit of context for what you said about unbroken line? Because a lot of our viewers might not know what you're referring to. What unbroken line? How does that relate to Strega? Like, what is Strega?
Well, Strega is kind of a general term for Italian witchcraft and the lines that kind of theoretically do run from Etruscan times or possibly even Neolithic times, or, you know, if you're taking it very canonically, you know, from Aradia herself, the Eve of Witches, you know, like that these traditions and this wisdom and this medicine, if you will, um, is largely the same, you know, and especially that it's something that is transmitted orally, and this is something that is passed directly from, you know, an elder to the next generation of practitioners. You know, the idea that these things have not been lost, like parts of them may be lost, but that they are universal in nature, and that like the wisdom is in the plants themselves, is in the earth herself, you know, like that these things can be just as readily rediscovered as if they were being transmitted for the first time, and that the combination of like what has been preserved orally and in that form with just the participation, there's kind of this ethos that like the the unbrokenness comes from like the wholeness of the practitioner, and that it can be healed and mended because it is medicine. It's a wisdom that is about medicine and like your personal healing, and like what you're contributing to it, your consciousness, and like the way that you're going about it as part of it, like your life force and your participation is part of that chain. You are linked in a chain. It's not like a torch that's just passed down and is the torch. It's the holder of the torch, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's other Wiccan traditions like Gardnerian that have this kind of notion of like an unbroken line as well. That's more of like the British, you know, Isles kind of version of that. But this idea that there were these ancient practitioners, and we have these kind of mythological, humorized figures like Merlin, you know, and the idea that there is knowledge that's passed from them, that, you know, little bits of that are in like what we're inheriting when we learn things. um, that's fun. It's like that's the mystical tradition, the idea, you know, like when you think of getting things passed down from Hermes Trismegistus himself, like it's there isn't a himself, that's why it's hilarious, but like also anything that's stemming from that intention therefore is kind of part of that lineage,
Mm-hmm.
because the tradition of being a Trismegistus and you participating in that is part of the thing itself. It's fun.
It's funny that you would mention torch because that's symbology very reminiscent of Hecate, who is basically the Wiccan version of all this. There's an
Right. It's
argument to
the
be made that Aradia kind of resembles Hecate in some ways, but definitely has a separate kind of tradition. Isn't necessarily specifically conflated with that. If anything, Aradia has more to do with a cat than with the dog, which is dog's more of like a Hecate thing. But nonetheless, Hecate with the torch and the key to the underworld, guiding people. Recently, a little bit of research that me and Corey Persephone in the comments here were doing has, I think we're pretty close to, we're basically assuming at this point, or like we've concluded that we think that Vanth, the Etruscan goddess depicted in the underworld with a torch, is Hecate, because in the myth of Persephone, of the search for Persephone, Hecate goes to the underworld with a torch searching for Persephone, and the Etruscans have a very this right here I have shown here. This is an actual Etruscan tomb. Depicted here on the right is Vanth with a torch, and then on the left is Charon, which Charon is the same as Charon in Greek, but Etruscan has a very unique kind of twist on him. Charon in Greek is not depicted this way at all. Charon in Etruscan is depicted with a mallet or I guess what else would that be? Hammer, and then kind of horned. All Etruscan deities have wings, basically, which might actually be the influence behind the idea of angels in their Catholic depiction, I suspect, in a lot of Gnostic and other traditions as well. But they're both very interesting, and there's kind of a duality there that they're both like the psychopomps of the underworld in some manner. Just wanted to mention that because you brought that up.
I like that example, and just the whole Hestia, hearth thing, and just the idea of being a fire tender, or being, like the Vestal Virgins being the ones that tend the fire. And as long as the fire doesn't go out, the faith is alive. So, like, does it really, like, did the fire maybe go out a little bit at some point? Like, who cares? It's going now. Like, does it really matter if it's exactly super extra the same fire, or is it more important whether we believe it's the same fire and we act as though it is, and we maintain it with the same sincerity as though it is? So I think that's the fire and the torch is a great example, because it's very much that. It's like having this communal civic fire that is constantly being cared for and tended to, that people can dip into and light torches and then go out and lead others, or, like, recover lost souls and stuff.
Yeah. So as getting back into the mausoleum concept, a connection here with contemporary a religion that's very big, Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, a descendant of Roman paganism, and furthermore Etruscan paganism. This is not very controversial, and here's the evidence. I mean, it is controversial, but it shouldn't be, because it's very much the case. Mausoleums, these are mausoleums in Mexico, for instance. There's a very heavy chthonic element to Roman Catholicism. And also, we see the same practice. I think, Persephone, you were just mentioning the similar to the puja shrines, there's general curio cabinets that people kind of get. We see that in Japan, but we also see that in Catholic families as well. They'll have stuff to their actual ancestors or to the saints, right? And the saints are more like an ancestral version of that. So straight up practicing the same thing. They adopted the Lares in their own tradition, and then we have that chthonic mausoleum concept, and that kind of fits. And they're called mausoleums, right? These large grave, similar to a sepulcher, really the same as a sepulcher.
The sepulcher is like the enclosure, the alcove, and then the mausoleum is like the total building, basically.
Mm-hmm. And so the comment here that Corey helped out with research on the etymology of beauty. Kalos means beauty. Sepulcher comes from sepelire, potentially, meaning to bury. Mausoleum comes from Mausolos, a king of Caria, the 4th century, whose tomb is in Halicarnassus. And the funny thing is, the mausoleum is one of the it was like one of the world wonders. And that's in Caria on the coast of Anatolia, in like around Ionia. It's that Greek account might be another one of those accounts where the Greeks just like coming later, they say, people might say that's a mausoleum, and they say, oh, that's the mausoleum. The guy who made it must have been Mausolos or whatever. So I'm not sure how seriously to take the Greek account of that, but it could be that they inherited that from a term, or yeah, maybe it was a king. Nonetheless, Caria is a very old region as well, kind of next to Lydia, and might have roots in deeper, older, chthonic Anatolian tradition, with the Anatolian mother goddess and stuff like that, I would suspect. So that would not be surprising. But yeah, a mausoleum it was a big practice in Asia Minor as well. I realized there too, which is interesting. And you were saying, what were you saying about the word pulcru? That's an alternative.
Pulchris is beautiful in Latin, so.
Pulchris. Yeah, interesting. And like it could be that the Latins used that as like something that people might not give credit, because they might say, oh, that sounds similar, but it's not actually etymologically linked. Is poetry is a thing that many people have done throughout all of time since we started writing and speaking. There's many accounts of Greeks, Romans, and other groups that have they'll have words that have multiple meanings, multiple interpretations, or deities that might have multiple meanings, and like all of the words that might sound similar, they put them together into interpretation. So it doesn't need to have only one meaning. It's really important to see all the words and all the things that might connect to.
Well, the reason that the beautification verb is important, I think, is like looking back to potentially like very ancient like hominid sources. Um, there's a lot of controversy or speculation. I guess I didn't think it was that controversial, but evidently, watching that weird documentary it's on Netflix right now that's got Patrick Stewart narrating. It was so underwhelming. I guess there's some controversy about like the Neanderthal burial practices as being particularly chthonic, and flowers being an offering that's common. They in that documentary, they're all like, "Oh, well, the flowers could have been carried there by these rodent things and stuff, so probably they didn't even do that." I'm like, I think we're going to a little bit too extreme of lengths to try to discredit what is obviously like a very intuitive human like practice. Like any child that comes across, like an unfortunate, bike roadkill or something, right? If there's a toad on the side of the road, they will just by instinct stoop to make some sort of like apology or offering or something, So like this idea of the offering of flowers and the chthonic aspect of beautification of a tomb, or giving flowers to the dead as part of their transition. Obviously that's kind of at the heart of the Persephone myth, and this idea of those things being related. So like seeing that so prominently displayed, I guess, in the Roman chthonic practice, and in such a fundamental part of like, actually, this is something that it's important that flowers are for. And perhaps going back to what we've talked about previously, like that behavior potentially being something that's very adaptive for humans or hominid species, of like doing like burying flowers, like because you can also be burying seeds. Like it could be that this practice was helpful for the spreading of symbiotically beneficial relationships to us, which is like having more flowers, having more pollinators, because like the ritualized flower collection and propagation, I think, is something that was very important for us to sacrifice, to make sacred, right? To have these like the Eleusinian mysteries and like these descents. Well, we've been working on research for the Sumerian. We'll get into like the Inanna and like other versions of like the descent to the underworld. We touch on them frequently, but we'll do a whole spiel about it. But like the association of the beauty goddess and the descent into the underworld, and the feminine, and this practice of like veils and flowers and all of the things that go with that. And if you look at things like the Mexican tradition, like Dia los Muertos, and all of the decoration and things like that, like this could have been something that was very deeply fundamentally adaptive, going as far back as like our hominid ancestors potentially.
Mm-hmm. There also
So
could
you
be
have to.
something. There also could be something adaptive about the cremation thing with the Indo-Europeans. That's a separate topic, but could relate to. We've talked about
Well,
the burning dead bodies when there's a plague, and there's very good evidence that a big plague, happened right before the Indo-Europeans spread into wherever they spread into, and might have affected the people that lived there before them. This might have been their practice, their way of warding off disease, right? Very practically, and it could be that the way that the burial and the preservation ways that the Neolithic people did before they got there were maladaptive in this small way when it comes to disease.
well, we've talked about that. It's possible it was maladaptive, but it seems to be that there's a coupling between those two modes, right? The cremation mode being particularly reactionary and being kind of
Mm.
after the fact, and the burial, those cultures coincidentally also having some of these other practices that we've talked about being preventative, right? Such as having the house snakes, such as keeping cats around. So if you look at, cultures that are particularly, we've talked a lot about like being pro snake in general, and how certain, pagan paths are a little bit more like snake deities are good, they're protective, they have, Asclepius, the Caduceus, the health, and all of that. So this knowledge of prevention being associated with things like that. And then you've got kind of at the tail end sort of this like, okay, that didn't work. Now we have to cremate them and try and prevent like the miasma. So like kind of the hypochondriac end of that. Yeah. But it's interesting that there do seem to be kind of two brackets of that, or like kind of those are a little bit at opposite ends. And I would argue that we see a very intimate coupling of like the preventative practices as we see in when we get further into it with the Dianic myth being associated with cats. Um, cats being kind of the parallel to the Baltic snakes we just talked about as being something that need to be kept around for vermin prevention, disease prevention, and the symbiotic domestication of certain things like flowers, like cats, like all of these things, and like that kind of like permaculture knowledge being a potential antidote. Because I think in the plague that we're talking about too, that would have been impacting the Neolithic people so severely, it doesn't seem like a lot of their normal means of prevention really would have been effective. Like if it's as the research is kind of suggesting, like cats don't necessarily go out and hunt marmots. Marmots are kind of like a big tanky animal compared to, it's not like rats or something that would have been, potentially something to be prevented. This is something that was much more originating from the wilderness. So it might have been more difficult to curb with their usual practices. Just food for thought.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I think I want to kind of quickly cover the Lucifer Suri topic, and then we can get into Aradia and Dionic practices. That is a lot of the discussion, actually, that we're going to have. So just to confirm the meaning of the tagline on the video. So Lucifer is not in the Bible, right? The light bringer, which is what his name means. He's conflated by a Catholic Church or by people with Satan, but Lucifer, I think he's an invented character by Milton, if I'm not mistaken, unless there are some older traditions here. Am I wrong? Yeah, his main reference in satanic occult these days is from Paradise Lost by John Milton. So this is 1600s, this kind of period. So this is Italian Renaissance, around the same period as there are many, the Renaissance is like people are looking at old writings of the Greeks and the Romans, and they're kind of rereading them, and then they're rethinking about them, recapitulating them in a way to integrate their current history in this medieval, post-medieval period, Christianity, Catholicism's influence. But as we know, the Italian Renaissance is where the Renaissance began. That's in Tuscany, Pisa, and what's the city you want to go to? Florence, right? Or your mom wanted to go to Florence, right? So that's all in Tuscany. And so I think the tarot, I was actually researching the tarot as well, and the very first tarot was made in Italy, in Renaissance Italy during this period as well, which is also a big synthesis of various materials. So that's kind of where Lucifer actually comes from, is from this Tuscan tradition of new intellectual, new poetic synthesis of various ideas. Paradise Lost is about Satan rebelling against God, and he's treated as an anti-hero, as having a justified purpose. So it's kind of like a recapturing of paganism within the context of Satanism, right? And that's deeply influential to us as well as to many occultic and neopagan sources. So this source was, I think, very evident in the writings of the book that Calley has there. Gospel of the Witches, Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches, by Charles Godfrey Leland. And that is, she referred to the period of 1899, so that's during like the Great Awakening, which is where in America and Europe there was a big revival of occultic and mystical interpretations of religion and Christianity and spiritualism, ghosts, spirits, all that stuff. So that's a little bit of context, I guess, for the sources that we're using here, that we're talking about. So the two characters we're looking at are kind of Lucifer and Aradia, and where their roots are. Lucifer is brought up, and we'll get to that with the story. He's brought up in this story, or in this the myth themes of Aradia here, as the partner of Diana. So Diana being the Roman name for Artemis. So this is essentially Lucifer is being treated as equivalent to Apollo in this context, the brother and then partner of Diana. We'll get into that. Just trying to provide some context. So Sori is Etruscan god, chthonic god of the sun. Very quickly, almost all sun gods in the world have a chthonic element, sometimes associated like him with volcanoes, in some ways with Tartarus. I think another influence for Lucifer, in my opinion, would be Apollyon and Abaddon. Now these are kind of satanic treatments. Come here. My cat is meowing. He wants to be part of the story. We'll get to the cat. There's cats in the story too, taters. Abaddon is like this Jewish term for this. It's like a term for Satan. It's one of his epithets, and he represents hell itself. Basically, the abyss, the dark abyss, far from the sun. Apollyon is a Gnostic kind of treatment. It like blended the Judaic Abaddon, Abaddon, with Apollo, with the chthonic Apollo, the sun god of the underworld. And so the Gnostics, of course, are Greek influenced, Roman influenced, synthesizing with Judaic and Christian ideas. Potentially Gnostic influence came before Christianity even, but that's a speculation. That's a running hypothesis of many people. So yes, when we're talking about the differences between Greek versus Etruscan influence or Roman deities, Apollo seems to have been less directly influencing of the Roman sun god, Soranus, because even linguistically, Soranus, or Sol, the very name we give to our sun, is Suri, is more like Suri. And a lot of the places where he was worshipped, actually, were, I think one is Mount Sorate, that's in Italy, or it's in Italy, it's actually close to Rome, it's like north of Rome, not too far. That's a sacred mountain. It has many caves of Soranus and of Suri as well. So that's a little bit of backdrop, and that is why I kind of suspect that of all the things that inspired Lucifer, it would be this chthonic Etruscan Roman Apollo, right? This Etruscan Roman Suri deity. And that's why he's specifically conflated with Satan. And that, alongside all the other imagery that we have of the Etruscan deities having wings, they're like angels, almost like fallen angels, I think there's a lot that we can look at into that. It's very, very interesting. So with that, I think that's all I need to say for now about that, unless anyone has any more questions that come up. So, Calley, could you start with, or let's talk about Aradia, Gospel of the Witches. Let's talk about um, Diana and Lucifer. How does Lucifer relate to Diana in this? You are okay.
Sure. Okay. So I guess the preface, I guess, is that as we were talking about earlier, a lot of this stuff is kind of pointing to what I call kind of the primordial phase of Greek, which is a little bit less. You're talking about a little lesser known period, right? You know about the Titanomachy, you know about Gigantomachy and Olympians and all of that. But the thing that's important to remember, especially approaching these from kind of a potentially Gnostic or Satanic lens, is that the Genesis story, the actual, all the way at the beginning, is actually like really Greek and really consistent with this as well. So, like, how much those two kind of interplay, like which came from which, is kind of hard to decipher. But definitely, like, if you want to get back to the beginning of things, this is the kind of agreed upon real actual beginning, which is the whole dark and light thing. And so that comes from this concept of Lucifer and Diana, or Tana, as it's reported in this book as her Etruscan name actually being, as being. So I guess I just say the thing first, right? So in the beginning, in the Greek primordial, there's a concept of day and night, and then darkness and light as places, right? There's like Aether, which is like the celestial realm itself, or the firmament, and then Orcus or Tartarus, which is like the darkness itself, which Josh kind of alluded to there as being this Abaddon abyss kind of thing. And so there's this duality that stems from the singularity, and that's the fall itself, or like that's the first move in the first separation. And it's very interesting that you have this concept of, Lucifer's fall and wanting to be separate from the singularity, wanting to have a separate consciousness from God and have his own thing going on, as being this very punished, naughty, evil, satanic thing. Whereas if you actually look at Genesis, it's like and God divided the light from the darkness, and it was good. Okay, well, is it good or is it super not good? Because you can't say both. It seems to be largely a good thing for us having separate consciousnesses and having life. So it's sort of this eternal tension between like wanting to be one with God and wanting to be, dead essentially, or part of singularity, not having separate consciousness, not having free will. Or is it actually good that we have free will? Because through free will, we have the possibility of virtue. We wouldn't have transcendence or virtue or goodness if there was not also the possibility for evil. So this explores those themes very interestingly. Instead of having this kind of chronological dimension of day and night, which are very important, or the dark realm and light realm, celestial and chthonic, which explore, of course, this duality of space, also very interesting. This duality, which is between Lucifer and Diana, doesn't have those dimensions. They're kind of the sun and the moon as kind of just light and dark, without those dimensions of space and time. And so what's very important and interesting to note is it's not siblings like twins like humans. These are not humans. These are completely abstracted concepts. And so like any like incest taboos or like any weirdness with that is like not a factor. These are just concepts, so I don't get hung up on it. The idea of them splitting and being separate entities is like the original like cell splitting. It's the possibility of sexual reproduction and of free will and evolution and change and mutation, which Josh talks about in like the myth of Phanes and like the cosmic serpent and egg, which are very, very painfully obvious symbols, right, for the egg and the sperm. and therefore, life itself stemming from.
Quick note about that. Yeah, when you were reading this out, because she just read this a little bit to me. I haven't read this book. Calley's read this book, and so she was reporting some of the things that the author's talking about. Now, again, this is coming from this specific author, Charles Godfrey Leland. So a lot of these are his ideas. They're his syncretisms and thoughts. So he seemed to see um, the dichotomy of Diana the moon and Lucifer the sun as the primordial duo, the primordial yin and yang, which is very similar in Orphic tradition, which is basically my practice or my belief, I guess, or my lens, with Phanes and Uranome, who are in some ways interchangeable. Of course, Phanes is the sun that cracks out of the cosmic egg. Uranome is like the phoenix, the cosmic hen that lays the golden egg of cosmic egg. But nonetheless, both are betrayed or portrayed basically as the axis mundi with the serpents around them, and they represent light and all of existence and potential. Another word for Phanes is protogonus, which just means the first, the very first, the first god, right? All the gods emanated out of him, it's said, and in a sense, Uranome represents the same thing as his mother. So this writing right here is like almost looking at this. Hermaphroditic is another kind of term for this sort of gender neutral splitting of one deity into masculine, feminine. And that's one interpretation he seems to have. I'll get the cat in a second.
Don't encourage him. He's going to keep doing this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Yes. So, so the example that this particular, I think this is actually in the introduction by A.J. Drew, not by Leland, but the suggestion that this duality is actually referring more to the Lilith, Adam, Eve situation, which of course we don't even hear about Lilith in the New Testament, which is super weird and stuff. But Lilith as potentially this primordial being, which is both, and then being conjoined and physically occupying one space and needing to be separated in order to, engage in reproduction and stuff, and that being kind of an original fall. Splitting into the sun and moon duality. I think that's most of what there is to say about it.
Mm-hmm. And specifically in his kind of telling of the origins of Aradia, who is the goddess of witchcraft, or at least the messiah of witchcraft, essentially is that since the cat keeps talking, he wants his character in the story. So he said that Lucifer every night cuddles a cat. Basically, a cat cuddles with him every night, which is a really cute idea. I haven't heard anywhere else. And the method by which Aradia is born, so this is the witch goddess, is Diana transforms into a cat, sneaks into bed with Apollo, and transforms back, and they have a kid. So again, like Calley was saying, these are gods, these aren't humans, so it doesn't need to be
right. We're not advocating for taking advantage of sleeping people. That is super not what it's about. The explanation metaphorically for why there is resistance for them to combine again is just reveling in the separation, and Lucifer in general having this staunchly independent, I want to go off and do my own thing. And so the implication is that he's resisting her advances more so for his rebel streak than any sort of unconsent. Let's say it's more just part of the character. But Diana is the explanation given for why she feels the need, besides that she's enamored with him because he's beautiful, because he's light, that there is, I don't know if you call it prophecy, but there's kind of this charge that she has to couple with him and give birth to Aradia as this liberator and as this Eve of witches, and this person to go down to Earth and act as this teacher of the way of magic, and to liberate all of the slaves. It's very, they talk about it quite extensively here in the Italian, about the need to liberate people from slavery in a way that is empowering, because if they are liberated from slavery just by running away from it, they turn into vagabonds and assassins, and she would like for them to have a better life. So it's all got this sort of tie-in to their whole character about being independent and having free will, being non-retaliatory, being empowering, being purposeful, being full of intention, and to build a good life on the planet Earth by being wise in particular, and knowing these traditions and knowing these ways, and kind of upholding one another, and not being douchey rich people. That is super extra important in here. Feels a little bit timely, maybe, of a theme today. A lot of poisoning going on in some of this,
Rebellion, yes. And at that time,
Yeah,
very specifically against the Catholic
palaces.
Church, right? And against the Machiavellian aristocrats, right?
Yeah, think like Renaissance. You've got the mobsters, you've got the wealthy patrons, and all of that, and there being this kind of pagan upwelling. We talked about that a little bit in these kind of rebellious art figures. You've got like Leonardo da Vinci being very much like an embodiment of Daedalus, an emanation in the modern time of these kind of timeless themes of like the inventor is the rebel, or the inventor who is kind of cheekily calling attention to some of the hypocrisy and hiding it in the art and hiding it in the means of liberation, let's say. So he's a very interesting character. But in a lot of that Renaissance art, you see these kind of themes and this kind of character of Diana ultimately as a liberator.
It's a lot like Assassin's Creed as well. Just to drop that. Basically, the entire Assassin's Creed lore is a Renaissance style recapitulation or recontextualization of ancient pagan deities in the context of modern or other times. That's kind of actually how they write their stories. It's very much in the line of these kinds of fictions, which are kind of deep and interesting. I always like Assassin's Creed for that reason. The gameplay is kind of repetitive and whatnot, but I'll always give them credit for really looking and immersing themselves in historical periods. It's pretty fun about that. And so the comment here, I'd like to go back to that kind of the point you were talking about the four primordial deities that you mentioned, just to kind of, for me, solidify that. When you brought that up, it was very interesting to me. So this would be Erebos, Nyx, Aether, and Hemera. And so these are, Erebos is the god of darkness, the abyss, and this is kind of the abyss under the world as well as the abyss of space. Let's think of it that way. Nyx, likewise, goddess of night, and the abyss in that sense. Aether is a god associated with light, also with air. His very name means air and is related to all these air skyfather type deities. Aether is basically the sky father in Greek, like a very ancient sky father, even older than Ornos, who's the sky itself. Aether is like almost air itself. And light, I always think of nebulas. That's how I think about it in a modern context. And then Hemera is day. And I think of Hemera as the closest in Greek that they get to a female sun goddess. That's at least my way of looking at it, especially after we just looked at Sole in Baltic last week. And of course, the sun goddess is very important for them. So I thought that was interesting. So what we're saying here, or what the author might be saying here, or at least I'm reading into it, is there's kind of a synthesis or syncretism going on with some of those deities and with Diana and Lucifer to a certain degree. So there's Erebos, the darkness, the abyss. You mentioned Abaddon, Apollyon, those kind of chthonic Apollo motifs. In a way, we might look at Lucifer as Erebus in that way. Orcus, you mentioned specifically Orcus, which is conflated with Erebos. Orcus being the chthonic ogre, the chthonic earth god of the abyss. Erebus's name literally means abyss, by the way, and is related probably to Absu, the Sumerian, and all that, just to throw that in there. Nyx, night goddess, is basically everywhere across the world. I would argue probably the most widespread goddess, right next to Gaia. And the concept here, which is very interesting to me, that I hadn't even thought about specifically, is that Diana represents this kind of cosmic night goddess, right? Which makes sense. I think I've heard of a few different traditions that have the moon as the queen of the stars, essentially. There's a motif in there. When you look at Thea, I think an old Titan goddess of jewelry and shine, and she's the mother of the moon and the sun or something, partner with Hyperion. I think she's also kind of similar in that, like the stars and light and glittering, everything that glitters in the night sky and such, and on the earth. That was an interesting connection. Aryan Rod, you, I think, mentioned in our conversation, not necessarily yet, as the crafter of the stars. The spider grandmother, various stuff. Yeah. What?
Yeah, so that doesn't really answer the question she had, though. Like, it's like birth is just not really the right word. It's not really like that. And like these deities are not actually gendered all that much. That may be something that's kind of ascribed later, but they're not necessarily like breeding with each other. It's more splitting. It's much more of like a cell dividing. That's why there's four. At least that's how my research has gone and how it was taught to me. So it's like the darkness is the default. It's just important. It's not like they're giving birth to them as much as they're splitting off or they're emanating. And it's important to always have darkness be the default and like the feminine aspect be the default, because that's how it's treated in all of these different traditions that kind of start with that chaos or void, and like the primordial split, or like the pang of childbirth, or like the original suffering. You see this also in like the Chinese concepts, where there's this the suffering female anima kind of dark primordial figure is like the acceptance of the necessity of separation, and that has to do with kind of the sacrificial, Mary, like knowing that the son will go and have his own life and be in danger, and that eternal protective urge to just like engulf and encompass. And so when it's talking about like this romance between Diana and Lucifer, it talks about her wanting to swallow him again, wanting to engulf him again, wanting that feeling of wholeness and connection through that again. And it's through that sporadic entanglement and separation that we get this rhythm of life, we get the cycles. And so what Josh is making these phonetic connections. So you've got Aradia being the word for this star goddess, the Eve of which is the daughter of the sun and the moon, is essentially a star goddess. And you see this in Arianrod of the Welsh, who is the queen of the castle of the silver castle, of the castle of the stars, of the wheel of the stars. And it also talks about, in here somewhere, I'll see if I can dig it up, Diana being the originator of the wheel, the celestial wheel, and then Lucifer being the one who turns it very specifically. So despite his seeming resistance to this whole endeavor, their role as the creators of this star goddess who goes down to become mortal, that implication is kind of like her entering this chronological domain, which they otherwise we're exempt from, that we see in like the day-night thing as a duality. Aradia is the embodiment of that in her becoming mortal, and what exactly does that mean? Because a lot of different contemporary things have kind of tried to draw like a parallel between, oh, she's just like the Lady Jesus. It's like, no, it's not quite like that. It doesn't have any of the sacrificial connotations of like sending our daughter to earth to suffer. It's not like that. She's just the first witch, because it's showing that the origin of this relationship, of this lineage, of this line is rooted in the stars. That's what the implication is. And so you see this in Ariadne with a thread, the continuous thread that is the way to navigate the labyrinth. You see this in Arachne to some extent, and other weaver goddesses. And Josh has talked about that a bit, the relationship of stars and weaving, and the motif of like the spider web or spider grandmother, or Indra's net being this thread of fate, continuity, and there's some relationship between constellations and spiders and stars and things like that. In the book, it describes the stars as being created by Diana, in a very strange way that involves animal organs and explosions and mice, that we're just not going to go through the whole thing on that one. You can imagine it. But it's very colorful, creative imagining for how we get to have, these interesting dome-shaped objects. But the meaning is, Aradia is the star goddess, is kind of the totality of it. I'm gonna get this wrong. Which goddess is it that they conflate for like Saint Seiya, that weird anime with the zodiac armor guy dude things, whatever? Is it Athena?
Hmm?
I want to say they use Athena.
Athena's
Somebody
the main one in that one,
me.
isn't it? Oh no, no, it's Venus. Venus, they make Aphrodite is like the main character in that series that they're protecting. Remember?
It's Athena, actually. Yeah, but it's that.
Is it
It's
Athena?
like they've
Okay.
got this central feminine star keeper of the zodiac wheel situation, and so that's Aradia.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned Athena. That's not too far. People consider Athena to be a weaving goddess as well, and it's a little odd because she doesn't necessarily have stellar connotations going on. She's much more of a civic goddess, and definitely um, has roots in Berber. So who knows where those go? And then other roots to Anat from Phoenician and Semitic tradition, who's literally just a split of Ishtar. It's just Ishtar has basically Astarte split into two forms, which became the Greek Aphrodite and Athena. But it's a mystery box in there. But nonetheless, yeah, interesting to bring that up. Making sure that I'm not muted. Okay. I'm just trying to turn off myself every time to make sure that the audio is proper. So yes.
Oh, and the phonetic evidence for that also is from Rod, in Aryan Rod or Aradia, that chunk means wheel. Right, it's where we get like rotation, where we get the round form. It's within her name we see evidence of this wheel of stars situation as well.
Mm-hmm. And or of the weaver's wheel as well, potentially too. And the weaving fate goddesses everywhere. It's very interesting. Just a comment here. Going back to Thea. Yeah, I made that connection intentionally because I know Thea is a very old goddess, potentially a moon goddess, and her own powers were taken over by Selene, her daughter, the same way that Helios took over from Hyperion. Yeah, because Selene and Helios are daughters of Thea and Hyperion. And Thea and Hyperion both must be very old deities that I find it interesting that their motifs or their concepts are a little more. Okay, you're back. Hello. Their motifs and concepts aren't like specifically just moon and sun. They have a few other things going on, like with Thea, it's jewelry and glittering things, and it's very interesting. By the way, pop quiz, not pop quiz, because I don't want to ask you a question, but the name of you pop quiz me, and I can't. I always fail the pop quiz. I can't do it. But the more you know, I guess, a big rainbow. The more you know. The planet that smashed into the Earth really early in our solar system's history, and this is long before our oceans formed or any of that. We were still molten rock, but long, long ago, there was another planet that was very close to Earth that could have been a planet between us and Venus or us and Mars, smashed into us and sent us spiraling, and then pieces of it broke off and became the moon. That planet, scientists have come up with the name Thea to describe it. And I always thought that was very interesting because Thea is a goddess of uh, jewelry and gems and like precious metals, and also the moon. And when you actually know, because in geology, I had to take classes in planetary geology, and I thought it was very interesting how our rare earth metals that we have on Earth, the reason we have so much, and also the reason that our core, our metal iron core, is so big compared to other planets, and therefore our magnetic field is so strong, therefore we can develop life and all these things, is because of this other planet depositing its heavy metal materials into ours. And so we have a little bit more. We have like double the amount. It's almost like we're a twin that, absorbed the other twin in a way. And the moon is the remnant of that. So that's still around the Earth. And the moon also is very light, so it doesn't have like iron core or anything. All of its iron has been sucked into us. So I thought that was an interesting connection because it's thematically resonant with actual science. The idea of Thea being precious metals and whatnot. So thank her for gifting the Earth its precious metals that we are currently fighting over, uh, unfortunately. And yeah, bringing up the Orphic tradition again, do we see it as light and dark coming out of the ordering of chaos? Yes. In general, the way that we kind of look at these primordial deities, like Calley was saying, is splitting and dimorphing into various groups. The Orphic tradition also sees the world as originating that way. A lot of emanationist, axial age mythologies like Zoroastrian, and then later Gnostic tradition adopted that idea. There's a lot of that in Hinduism as well. A lot of these different pagan mythologies that have they've had a philosophical phase where philosophers and sages kind of got to write poetry and books and prose and stuff on them. They tend to have an emanationist structure. It just seems to be what we humans do when we are trying to make sense of deities. That's at least my my view on why it happens, why it turns out that way. Basically we were like abstracting the traditions that people lived with to a grandiose interconnected system. Now, that system, whether or not it was in place during the Neolithic or in very old traditions, probably not, right? They probably didn't necessarily see everything as an emanation, I would argue. Maybe you would argue differently, but nonetheless, it's very interesting, and it is fun to think about.
I mean, I think they really probably did have concepts of emanation for like these forces of physics. It's not really all that unlike how we talk about it. If you really want to go super hard into those concepts, I did make a whole video about imagining the zodiac as the forces of physics and like what is it that they're actually acting on in this world and universe. Like if we didn't give them such colorful personification, is what's it pointing to? So I don't think it's really that far fetched to think that they had certain primordial concepts that were not like actively worshipped. Like you talk about like Pontus and like these other primordials that are sort of like beyond time. Because they do in this primordial phase kind of point to specifically when time came in as sort of like a factor or an axis, and they obviously have this concept, as far as day and night. Like they're also pointing to time, and you talk about like the Ore. It's like, well, these divisions are meaningful, and when they come into play in the sequence of creation is also meaningful. So this original divergence of darkness and light being beyond the span of space and time is kind of important as being kind of just a split. But I did find this section, uh, and I want to read this a little bit first because obviously this is the funnest part. Okay, so Lucifer had a cat whom he loved beyond all creatures, and it slept every night in his bed. A cat beautiful beyond all other creatures, a fairy though he did not know it. Okay, I want to see that cat. I want to see the Uber cat, right? That was the original OG Apollo cat. Um, and so this part is very interesting cosmologically and like consistent with like in Hinduism a little bit, this concept of Om, or the concept of humming being the first word. You see this in a number of traditions, and it's very important. So this was the first fest. Oh, this is right after the cat thing. I'm not going to read you. You can imagine. Okay, so she transformed into a cat and did her thing. And so this was the first fascination. She hummed the song. It was as the buzzing of bees or a top spinning around, a spinning wheel, spinning life. She spun the lives of all men. All things were spun from the wheel of Diana, and Lucifer turned the wheel. And it also says that she was the mother of, she was the queen of witches and the mother of the fairies and the goblins. And it's very interesting that Italian witchcraft in particular has this goblin concept. And they have different like color affiliations. And it's very fun in Renaissance. It's very like labyrinth, like that whole chthonic thing. Because we talk about like dwarves and fairies and like all of these things, but goblins, they're kind of fun, aren't they? And there's something very like Italian and tarot feeling about all of that.
The Harry Potter goblins in particular seem very Italian. They seem a little more because they're not like evil. They're just kind of a little greedy. They're from the underworld. They're basically dwarves thematically, but they have more to do with money and merchandise and stuff like that. Which
Yeah,
is pretty
they've got all
interesting.
these tasks, right? And they're it's like a goblin market is a very distinct mythological place. You see that in like Hellboy and other things, and it's very interesting. Diana in this depiction being a matron of thieves, in particular, or a freer of slaves. In some ways, the Strega interpretation takes a lot of like hermetic kind of qualities, because originally it would have been, Hermes, who was protector of travelers and thieves and commerce and a lot of those things. So it's interesting how Diana kind of takes on some of those airy qualities and those jobs. What do you think about that?
I think it's very interesting. It's very different from how I normally would have thought of Diana, because again, it seems to me that she's uh, a synthesis. They're syncretizing her with basically every divine feminine figure. There's some distinction. She doesn't seem to be explicitly associated with like Earth goddess motifs. That doesn't seem to be here at all. It seems to be mostly like celestial and um, not even necessarily chthonic per se. Most of it is like dark celestial, which is not necessarily dark isn't necessarily chthonic, right? Which is very interesting. It actually like okay, so there's a whole other side to this that has to do with some of the potential origins of the name Aradia that I was looking into. That's the research I was actually doing before we had this discussion. Um, there, the running theory, the closest running theory for where Aradia's name came from is from Herodias, which is a Catholic, or she was a Hebrew princess during the Herod dynasty in Judea. So this is Judea run by the Romans. Herod was, of course, the dynasty. I think that was ruling around the time Jesus was crucified. So the Catholics kind of, I think she specifically condemned or was involved with condemning John the Baptist to crucifixion. So the Catholics kind of demonized her, and very interesting, very specifically, they said that when she died, she was cursed to wander the sky forever and only allowed to rest on the tops of trees between midnight and dawn. So almost like this twilight period, like this kind of witching hour or witching time, so to speak. And the interesting thing I found about that is that these 50 daughters that Diana is said to have had with Endymion, who is the shepherd, this like other shepherd guy, not necessarily Lucifer. Now I'm not certain, but it could be that these are the spirits that follow Diana across the sky, the moon across the sky every day, and they're witches, like, or at least in this tradition, the Arabian tradition we're talking about, they're these witch spirits. And we were just talking about, again, last week with Baltic Pantheon, Regana and the Reganas, which is these witch spirits, which are not chthonic, but they travel across the sky at night and during the winter, and they're these witchy, ghosty spirits. And they follow Regana around, basically. Or she rules kind of a legion of them. And that was very interesting, especially since she's in contrast, or she fights with Solia, the sun goddess. And by fighting the sun goddess, she brings about winter. And then it's upon another chthonic deity to come in and lead the ancestors, our ancestors, against her winter ghosty forces. So that was interesting. I wonder almost if the Baltic isn't taking from this, at least the reconstructed Baltic, because it was actually kind of hard for us to find the original sources on the story of Regana and the witch. There's just a general understanding that this witch goddess or these witch spirits were around. But of course, the negative connotation of witch is very Catholic, right? It's a very constructed Catholic thing. So I almost suspect that those stories in Baltic might actually be post-Christian stories, or like a reconstructed lens looking at it like this. But nonetheless, it's very interesting that these witch spirits, they seem to be related to Aradia and her evolution in Italy. That's where I suspect maybe the name came from. They also have evidence of her in Romanian, and the Romanians, of course, are an offshoot of Roman, and they were Catholicized later on in history. There's a lot of Romanian myths that are kind of very Catholicized. Generally, when you talk about Romanian, they're a big blend of many different things. There's a little bit of Romantic language and influence in there. There's really old. There's a bit of Gothic, I think, Gothic German in them now too, and then much older, but probably not much survives, would be Dacian, the Dacian people who are related to Thracians and Phrygians, and we like Phrygians because Phrygians are orphan traditions, so who knows what's going on there. But they also have Erodiada, who most certainly is another name for Aradia, or specifically the Catholic Herodiad or Herodias. And I think she also, she was called the Queen of Fairies. So there's kind of like a Maeve, like queen of fairies or witches or fairy is witch. You know, there's that thing going on. Again, indicating a Catholic interpretation of something, but was there some deeper, older tradition of these spirits that was going by? I actually had a very interesting lens. My suspicion, or one possible angle to look at it, is the Aranias, and that's the Furies of Greek. And even linguistically, Aranias, it sounds very similar. I mean, that'd be something to look at. Corey Persephone is to look at the linguistics of Aranias, because the Furies are these feminine spirits that basically their wrath, their retribution and wrath, whenever anyone has like a curse or a wishes vengeance upon someone else, then they chase them down, drag them down to hell, basically. And that very much has kind of a witch curse connotation there that doesn't necessarily require a Catholic or a Christian basis, right? It could be that they were kind of merged into that at some point.
Well, Aranias are usually associated with Eris, the goddess of discord. So I'm not sure where you would be getting Diana from on that.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. I think this Diana that he's writing about in his book, Gospel of the Witches, is a very syncretic Diana that's taking from various female deities and motifs, including Erin. Like you, for instance, use Lilith. Lilith is one influence of his that he he conflates or syncretizes the idea of Lilith with this idea of the primordial Dianic goddess. And that's an example of obviously taking a famous or important feminine icon in satanic tradition and then kind of twisting it into the Diana character. That's at least how I'm seeing it. You can see it however you want to see it.
Like, that's not in any of these stories. Like, that's just, he's just presenting that as like an alternate way of thinking of it, or like what the closest like stage would be. That's not necessarily like a thing that's happening in the stories, or like what you're describing is not really. So I wouldn't go too hard on that. No.
Mm-hmm.
We could just read one of the actual stories and look what's happening.
Go do.
What kind of flavor would you like?
What kind of flavor would I like?
Lots of flavors.
Mm-hmm. I'll take any flavor.
Here's a weird one that's going to trip you up, so I'm just going to read it in its entirety. Okay. This is Diana, Queen of the Serpents, giver of the gift of languages. I know, you're tripping already. In a long and strange legend of Melambo, a magician and great physician of divine birth, there is an invocation to Diana which has a proper place in this work. The incident in which it occurs is as follows. One day, Melambo asked his mother how it was that, while it had been promised that he should know the language of all living things, it had not yet come to pass. And his mother replied, "Patience, my son, for it is by waiting and watching ourselves that we learn how to be taught. And thou hast within thee the teachers who can impart the most. If thou wilt seek them, hear them, yes, the professors who can teach thee more in a few minutes than others learn in a life." It befell that one evening Melambo, thinking on this while playing with a nest of young serpents, which his servant had found in a hollow oak, said, "I would that I could talk with you. Well, I know that ye have language, as graceful as your movement, as brilliant as your color." Then he fell asleep, and the young serpents twined in his hair and began to lick his lips and eyes while their mother sang. And we're going to do the English, not the Italian, because I'm going to butcher it. Diana, 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 queen of all enchantresses, and of the dark night, and of all nature, of the stars and the moon, and of all fate or fortune, thou who rulest the tide, who shinest by night on the sea, casting light upon the waters, thou who art mistress of the ocean, in thy boat made like a crescent, crescent moon bark brightly gleaming, ever smiling high in heaven, sailing to on earth reflected in the ocean on its water, we implore thee, give this sleeper, give unto this good Malambo the great gift of understanding what all creatures say while talking. This legend contains much that is very curious, among other things an invocation to the firefly, one to Mephitia, the goddess of malaria, and a long poetic prophecy relative to the hero. It is evidently full of old Latin mythological lore of a very marked character. The whole of it can be found in the unpublished legends of Virgil, for anyone interested in the rest of all that. But how's that land for you, Josh? Because we've talked a little bit about the relationship between perhaps this more kind of terrestrial uh, Diana being actually having more watery qualities or having more oceanic qualities, less of like Diana the leaping through the glade with all the deer and stuff, and more having this moon boat pulling the tide. What do you think of that?
Well, it sounds to me like right there they're syncretizing her directly with Luna, and in particular, um, the Etruscan Luna, which is the basis of Luna, the Roman moon goddess, and that's the same as Selene in Greek. So again, daughter of Hyperion and Thea, so a much older titaness of the moon. Etruscan Luna or Lucna or Luzna, and she's associated with the tides. So like the moon pulling the tides, the Etruscans had more of a kind of oceanic relationship between the moon and the sea. And I don't know if that comes up in Greek or Roman Luna exclusively, or Selene as much individually. So that's why I'm seeing in there in the pulling of the tides of like a general synthesis, syncretism of all moon motifs and goddesses that they had access to or they could get their hands on. Another thing like that's saying in the Wikipedia article here is in the neopagan tradition, which again a lot of these sources we're using are part of really reconstructing ancient religion. I'm seeing this as Diana being like the framework on which all these other female deities are being kind of syncretized together into the great goddess, which the great goddess or Hecate that's referred to in like a modern Wiccan practice. That's how I'm seeing it, as like the divine feminine. And there's a similar thing that goes on with the divine masculine in Wiccan, where it's a synthesis, a syncretism of the horned god is referred to. There's Atho. He's like Cernunnos. He's like Kronos. He's like, in some way, Shiva. He's like the man. But one could also kind of stretch that perspective and to say, like you could see the horned god in probably every male deity if you were to look hard enough, or you were to want that, right? If you want to have all the aspects kind of unifying into one person. I guess I see things as a little more complex than two, but I see two as well as all the others. That's why I might seem to be resistant, but I'm like, it's throwing me for a loop. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about it?
I think, yeah, the establishment of this Diana being very much more focused on cycles, on like time, on the moon itself, and these kind of watery aspects, because it also talks about her creating rain, creating stars, these things. Yeah, so I think it goes pretty far away from. I mean, she still has all these animal associations, but it's definitely less like earthy wilderness Artemis kind of vibe. And it's very interesting. Like the loudest signal to me from all of these practices is like her being this goddess of freedom and liberation. which they kind of emphasize in the Greek version, you know, Artemis being like a virgin and being like wild and untamed and untouchable and, you know, no man and all this kind of stuff. And like those being kind of weird things to emphasize, I think, to me, or at least to me, it always kind of landed a little strangely compared to this kind of empowered Diana character who's like very much in command of her own sexuality and free will and all of that. And then taking on this role of being an ultimate liberator through the cycles of life, because it's got this concept of like the tyrants not being able to reign forever because they are mortal, because there is death, because their fate is woven, and that there is kind of like always this opportunity to prevail, you know, should you choose to invoke her, you know, should you choose to like study or empower yourself or learn these secrets. And then, you know, with like the snake myth, you know, talking about how like the secret to like becoming empowered and learning these things is like being able to pause and listen and, you know, just kind of make this wish of like, I wish to be knowledgeable, I'm making myself available, I'm going to try to pay attention to nature and the patterns that I might be able to recognize. And in this way, you know, through that kind of offering, you can become in touch with her magic.
Yeah, you know, on the note of this serpent thing, actually, another connection I see is Dione, who is this really old Doric mother goddess associated with the oracle at Dodona. That's in Epirus, basically around where Albania is today, just on the coast, right next to southern Italy. Um, there, there's some indication. I mean, that's by Illyria, and it's interesting because the other name for Diana that I just learned today was the Etruscan name for it is Tana, and that's linguistically even more. You know, the change of the D over to a T. That's something that they share with the Illyrians, who also the D changes to a T with Thana, and that's their wild goddess of the hunt. Her counterpart, by the way, is the horned god, the wild god of the Illyrians. So that's actually very similar to the Wicca in that sense, a moon god and a wild god. There's a whole subtext there, actually, where um, I think there's Pan and Pandia as well, and Pandia is a moon goddess. So there's there's a few different connections that someone could, if they wanted to, go hunt down. With this, there's an old horned god in the wild who's partnered with um, the moon goddess, the wild goddess of animals, and that might also be like Endymion, who's like kind of a wild shepherd. I don't know if he's like, I don't think he's specifically just a shepherd of animals in the sense of like a prairie. I think he had some forest connotations, but I could be mistaken, or like a hunter actually. Orion's also kind of in there somewhere because Orion's said to be a lover of Artemis at some point. But the the Dione connection as a kind of oracle. Of course, the oracle at Delphi, the Pythia, is the interpreter there, and that's very serpentine. So I wonder, although I haven't looked into Dione probably enough, I wonder how much serpentine stuff could be at Dodona as well. I haven't looked into the Dodona mysteries, but there could be something going on there for sure. Yes, okay. There was another thing I wanted to bring up as well. Oh, okay. So you were just talking about liberation, rebellion, all that stuff. Here's a really interesting parallel. And Chia, or Huitaka, I mentioned her in the moon goddess video for the Alta Oracle. She's the moon goddess of the Muisca in Colombia. They're most closely related to, mythologically speaking, to the Inca. They she's a goddess associated with all those same things, like sex, freedom, dance, music, and the arts, liberation, and specifically in the story, she led a rebellion against the king of the gods in the context there, which was Bochica. And Bochica, interestingly, is like Triptolemus Hermes. He's actually a deity of wisdom and knowledge and civilization. And she led a rebellion with the thunder god Chibchacum to try to usurp him. They actually failed, and she was punished by being transformed into a white owl. And then she kind of roamed the world. Again, a little bit of a connotation of like being a flying around sort of ghostly entity by the end of it. Associated with the moon, white owls. The thing about that, when we look at Catholicism, obviously Catholicism has had a huge influence in Colombia. And in the writing down of any stories by Native American groups, we can sometimes see that some Catholic motifs are written in there, or like with Irish tradition, sometimes the deities have to be obscured a bit by being treated as people in a story, legends rather than myths. There's like this small connotation. In this case, there is definitely a lot of reconstruction of Bochica by the Spaniards. They literally built actually I don't know if I have it in here. No, I don't have the picture in here. I should put it in my database here, but I had it in both that video on the moon goddess as well as my other video on the Gemini, Mercurius, god of the messenger god, I think. On that video, I talk about Bochica having a statue in Colombia that is a bearded white man, like straight up European white man, and he's sitting there with a big staff, almost like something of a Gandalf or a Merlin, as you said, and he's standing over a few native statues, native people, have statues basically bowing down to him, and he's telling them about civilization and how to be civilized and whatnot. So now that's an example where there was a motif that almost certainly, because it is shared throughout the world, including the Americas, that there was a deity, not a white European deity. You're not ever really explicitly said to be like that, but one of their own people or an actual god who spread civilization and agriculture or whatnot. This is the great civilizer motif found throughout the world. You see it, Quetzalcoatl also is related to this. So the Spaniards coming in took that motif and they said, okay, well, we can use what they already believe and then put our face on it, and they will worship us, or they will treat us like we're part of the canon, basically. So that, I almost wonder, since in that story, Chia is very much connected to that other character that we know has been reconstructed, how much could Chia have had an influence of any of this Dionic motif? I wonder. It would be weird because 1492 versus 1600 is not, it's different. Whatever motifs could have possibly gotten into Catholic from that would have had been before the Renaissance. So maybe this other character, but regardless of whether it's a real connection, I thought I'd bring that up because she's also treated by contemporary Colombians as an icon of feminism. So maybe there was some reconstruction much later after the Renaissance to recapture her energy as representing that. And because she's rebelling against Bochica in ancient sources, maybe they rewrit it so that she's rebelling against the Catholic Church in the context of Colombia now, right? I'd have to look more deep into that, but that's an example where very much this might actually be present in Colombia as well. With that, are there maybe any other thoughts we want to wrap up with? Or questions that you might want to answer? I know there's a lot of comments here. I've been trying to keep up with them. and I try to state the questions out loud as well, because I don't think when we set up a schedule stream, the live playback works. So, um, if anyone ever has questions during a live screen, um, commenting with the most important ideas would also be helpful. Just saying. But yeah, I'll try to read through these out loud if they come up.
I don't see any more questions in here. They're mostly just points.
Mm-hmm.
But so I guess like to wrap up the question, I think we've covered pretty thoroughly. Is Lucifer Etruscan? I think we've kind of shown that he's perhaps a lot closer to that, both in his ancient form and as Lucifer, Milton's kind of interpretation and invention. Oh, the one other note about like, is he in the Bible? He's only mentioned once as being a king of Babylon or something like that. So yeah, Lucifer is definitely like a fairly Renaissance-y modern kind of invention, but not an insignificant one. I don't like. One thing that I always want to caution against in any of these discussions is like, just because it's more ancient doesn't mean anything. It's just more ancient. It's not like more pagan or more important or more official or more like there's just no hierarchy like that. Every single age in which people have spent some time and some attention on these themes or explored them, whether that's a reconstruction effort, whether that's within the Renaissance, whether that's going on right now, like any effort that any person puts forth in worship, essentially, and like paying attention to these things, preserving them, improving on them, exploring them. That's all of it. It's not like one is like more sacred or more correct. And I think like that whole notion is something that's been really corrosive within the pagan community, or like the over over academia emphasis, like trying to be more like cited or documented or legit. That's not to say we shouldn't have citations or we shouldn't do our research or we shouldn't try to prove it as much as possible. But the litmus test really for whether it's like pagan or not is if it's useful, if it's something we can still embody, if it's something that makes sense or does something or leads to a practice that is ultimately adaptive. Like those are the questions that we really need to start asking ourselves, because we could lose ourselves forever, in that sort of like academia rabbit hole of like, oh, well, this says this and this says that. Like, it doesn't always matter what it says. What matters is how it's applicable to us, how we're going to live, what it's going to be put into. And so I think like looking into the Etruscan culture and like what did these unique deities potentially, like what did this unique take on the moon and sun deities or on the concept of darkness and light, what did it afford them as far as a lifestyle, and like why it's so important maybe to pay attention to how they managed to incorporate these things is because they acted as quite a bridge. Like if we're kind of rolling with this hypothesis that they were never fully extinguished and then a lot of their legacy is what's made it perhaps the whole way, from bridging from potentially as far back as Neolithic times, some of these concepts, or at least the structure of these concepts, all the way through, the Renaissance reconstruction, and perhaps like having some lived practices still among the Strega witches, and perhaps even among the Roman Catholics, whether they'd like to admit that or not. Like, are there actually some stems of these traditions and these practices and this cosmology and this way of thinking? You can't really argue when looking at like, the Aether primordial stuff, or even this, Aradia sun and moon thing. You can't possibly argue like, oh, there's no, and God divided the light from the darkness and it was good. There's a bit of that in there.
Oh yeah, and actually, like there's even a tradition in Colchian I wanted to mention with going way back where the Heliads, so the sons and daughters, the children of Helios, are is another word for witches, and so Medea, Circe, or Kirke, however you want to say it, and all these prominent witch characters and deities within Greek and other sources, they're all said to be stemming from Helios. That's another interesting little connection in there. And so, Yeah.
And they're heroes in their own right. Like all of these are a company. You look at like, Jason and Medea, like they're heroes in their own right, just because they're not categorized quite the same. But like they're appearing as prominently in the stories and having these unique characteristics, just the same. It's just like it's a female hero. So we don't call it quite the same. But the timelessness of those and like them being emanations of these primordial witchy characters, like what is that? What's up with that? And I think it's important to know, because we're still here talking about these things. So whatever these traditions are, they're part of the foundational civilizing force that is, humanity, that's allowed us to get to this point. And I think it's important at this juncture in history to be kind of like aware of them and perhaps reflective of them and critical of them, maybe in some places, to look at like which parts of this are adaptive. Is it more pro sustainability, or is it more ecologically sensible to have a worldview in which, maybe we're not the dominators? If you look at like the Ishmael book, and you look at like these fictional works that are sort of challenging our storytelling itself, challenging kind of our modern mythology, and looking at what serve, yeah, what role does our storytelling serve? And in particular, Ishmael is very critical of the Judeo-Christian ethos of like go forth and multiply, and we inherit the earth and we are meant to be lords over it. It's very, very critical of those points, and it's suggestive of like, what if we told a different story, and what if we look at a different premise as far as being stewards of the earth, or being co-species with our brothers and sisters, which is a much more animistic worldview. And it's like, well, what do you get from that? Is that attitude gonna make us survive as a human species this many more years? Like, can we simulate that? Can we think about that? Can we look at the trajectory that we're on? In the same way that you would look at your own lifestyle and be like, hey, if I don't quit smoking, am I gonna cut 10 years off my life? We can look at ourselves as a species in the same way of like, if we don't give up on exploiting fossil fuels, if we don't stop treating the earth like our dumping ground, like, will we still be alive to be telling any kind of story at all? And is there a story that maybe helps us like tell more stories?
Hmm. And that's probably a good place to coalesce all this under our kind of efforts going forward. What Calley and I were talking about potentially doing in future live streams, in maybe instead of doing like explicit presentations, which we might want to offload onto more edited videos, because it's been a while since I edited together a video. I do have one in the works right now, but um, it's kind of like a fun pastime side one. We would like to talk maybe about storytelling, or like actually do storytelling, and do it in a way that everybody who watches us or who joins in, leaves comments, joins the server that we have, can make their own stories, or rewrite their own stories, reconstruct or construct their own pantheon, their own practice, their own story. Uh, we've been thinking about maybe doing that. Uh, coming up with new stories, and like me and Calley have some differences sometimes in our interpretation or our story writing intentions, and we thought maybe showcasing those and inspiring other people to also write could be a fun thing to do in the future. If you like that idea, comment in the permanent comments what what you if you think that's cool, or what you think we should do. So, Calley, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, are we getting fully spicy with that? Or are we actually introducing that as a? I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Yeah,
Even though
I'm
fresh
introducing it now to
hypothesis, we
see.
always feel spicy about anything new, but it's actually, I think, the most connected to um, some old concepts of mine that have just kind of never made it to fruition, and I've always been sad about it. And like I've been thinking about it more since we talked about it this morning, about like, no, actually this kind of brings a whole lot of things together that are pretty important. And I think will be more fulfilling in the long run, because like when we asked ourselves like, what is the purpose of the research, what is this in service of, what are we really hoping to do, and like why is it sometimes so frustrating to try to come up with a format for it or like figure out the priorities. And it's like, well, because all of this research, all of the backlog is supposed to be in service of writing new myths or reimagining them. And we've alluded to that a few times, but then like there's always been this hesitation to kind of pull the trigger and make that like the activity that we're actually doing or like what we're dedicating the time to. So we're going to go ahead and take the leap. I think we'll experiment with it for the stream next Sunday, where we want to actually spend time streaming our process as far as writing new myths. And we've also decided to embrace our confrontational nature and accept the fact that we disagree constantly and make that actually maybe a part of the presentation, or at least maybe an entertaining part, where we kind of do work separately and then compare and see like kind of what's working better. So yeah, next week will be kind of a free form session where Josh is working on a myth and so am I. And we're debating right now whether we're just gonna like set a premise or ask a question. But it seems to us like that the most interesting and entertaining myths are seeking to explain something, or they're seeking to look at a phenomenon and create a just extremely colorful and memorable way of relating to it and relating it to the world and perhaps coming up with a fable or a lesson or a takeaway of some kind from it. So we're going to mess with that this week and see if we can make that a part of also a community practice. We had discussed in the Discord having other, maybe bringing back some other structured activities. And the one that keeps continually coming up is the one that started it all. If you don't know where to start, go back to the beginning. So in place of what used to be kind of, poetry club, right, where I got my beginnings, we're going to spend some time in the Discord doing kind of open mic with readings, though, of it can be, if you want to read an Orphic hymn or you want to get some practice just with like recitation, or if you do have an original work that you have like a myth that you're working on, or a song or a dino like we talked about from the Baltic practice last time, or an invocation or a rhyme, or maybe something that you would like to use like for your coven or your community practice and you want to see if it sounds good, or you just want to bring something to practice. If you'd like, we don't have that scheduled yet. I'm not sure which day that's going to be, but if you want to start compiling just like some of your favorites just to read out loud and see how it feels, let's play with that. It's fun. So magic definitely happens when there's just a bunch of people doing it, and it was really magic in the poetry club to have people who had never really performed poetry before, or they'd never even really spoken in public in that way. And you don't have to go on face cam like this. It can just be like spoken, off, just the voice or whatever, if you're feeling self-conscious. But I found that a lot of people really built up a lot of courage really quickly and were able to dive in and like have this extremely cathartic, expressive experience, getting to the point of even presenting like things they had written themselves in their own voice. And it was just so cool because like you don't necessarily notice the absence of that because you've got YouTube now, you've got so many of these performances, and we've had Zoom for a while. But there's something that hits really different about like personal work, poetry, or something that's kind of risky, that still feels like vulnerable and risky. And like, are people going to think this is lame? Is it okay to rhyme things, or is it going to sound stupid? And I don't know. We'll play with it. I'm excited to see what Josh comes up with.
Yeah, I mean, are we going to come up with something? Oh, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I might, maybe I'll try starting to write something. Probably. I probably won't share the last one I did, I think, that you read, and you were like, I'll have to update that one a little bit. It was a little dark, let's say it that way. But yeah,
there'll be some rules and guidelines for like certain of this. Obviously, in recreating this myth, there are certain things we're trying to avoid, like grapiness. There will be none of that tolerated. But other than that, torture. We're not really doing like hyper-violent stuff. It can be. Obviously, we have creation myths where people get, cut up and turned into different features of geography. But like we're trying to be a little bit more not like that, though.
Yeah, kind of telling it in a way for today, like what people actually want to aspire to and whatnot. But yeah, we could talk about that. next week. Thanks as always for sticking with us and hanging out with us. I hope you got something out of all this conversation, back and forth, tangents and whatnot. And again, leave a like if you haven't already. Comment, help us out. Our links are in the bio. We have 2 books. The 2 books I referenced today are in the description already. Those are Amazon links. And then we've got the two ways to help us out and help us continue to research in these very dark times. That would be GUMROAD, where we have a bunch of available downloadable content, digital content like charts and stuff that we make, and guides for mythology. And then if you want something fun like candles or crafts and our merchandise, we've got that on our Etsy at Studio Pandemonia. So, as always, I'll shout those things out. I'll see you all next week. Signing out now. See ya.